Get off my land before I put a hole through that fine coat of yours." Sarah Whitfield cocked the hammer of her late husband's Winchester and leveled it at Marcus Bell's silver belt buckle. The banker's smile didn't slip, but his boots stopped moving on her porch steps. Behind him, the noon sun beat down on Redemption Flats like a hammer on an anvil, and the wind carried the smell of dust and something else. Cattle rot. Maybe, from the arroyo where 3 of her steers had died last week without explanation. "Sarah, darlin'," Marcus said, tipping his hat back with one careful finger. "That's no way to greet a man who's come to help." "You've come to buy," she said. "Same as the others. 14 suitors in 8 months, and every one of you smelling like vultures the day my Thomas was put in the ground. 15 now, if you're counting." His teeth showed white beneath his mustache. "And I'm not here to court you. I'm here to save you. Your fence line is broken in 6 places. Your well's running low. Your cattle are dying, and everyone in 3 counties knows the Whitfield spread is bleeding out." The rifle didn't lower. A grasshopper clicked past her boot. Somewhere behind the barn, a loose shutter groaned in the wind, and Sarah felt every joint in the ranch creaking with her, as if the whole homestead was a wounded animal too proud to lie down. "Then I'll bleed alone," she said. "Get on your horse." Marcus studied her a long moment. He was handsome in the way rattlesnakes were handsome. Clean lines, patient eyes, and something dead beneath the surface. He touched his hat again, and this time the smile reached his teeth. "You'll change your mind by autumn, Sarah. When the snow comes and there's no one to mend your roof, you'll remember I offered kindly first." He turned. His boots rang down the steps, and as he mounted his black gelding and rode toward the gate, Sarah caught it, the small nod he threw toward the ridge above the north pasture. A signal to someone. She stood on the porch until his dust settled, then longer, until the sun burned her shoulders through the thin cotton of her morning dress. Only then did she lower the rifle, and only then did her hands begin to shake. Thomas had been dead 11 months. She had run the ranch alone for 9 of them, and she had turned down every man in Redemption Flats: the lawyer with soft hands, the cattleman with 3 prior wives, the young preacher who talked of God's plan for widows, the marshal's brother who smelled of cheap whiskey and cheaper promises. She had said no, and no, and no again, and the town had begun whispering that Sarah Whitfield was a woman who preferred grief to good sense. Let them whisper. She had loved once, all the way through, and she would not let some grasping stranger fold her into his ledger just because a fever had taken her husband in the spring. But the fence was broken. Marcus hadn't lied about that. She walked out to the north pasture that afternoon, boots crunching on sun-baked earth, and found the damage worse than she'd feared. 3 sections of split rail lay in the grass like the ribs of a dead animal. 2 posts had been pulled clean out, not fallen, pulled, the earth around them scored with the marks of a rope. Someone was cutting her fences. Sarah knelt in the dust and pressed her palm to a hoof print. Fresh. Not her horse. Not any horse she knew. That was when she saw him. He stood at the far end of the pasture, near the creek, and for one wild moment she thought he was a scarecrow, tall, thin, still as fence post. Then he moved. He was hauling a rail out of the grass, hefting it onto his shoulder like it weighed nothing, and carrying it back toward the broken section. He wore a dust-gray duster, a black hat pulled low, and a beard that hadn't seen scissors in months. There was a rifle slung across his back and a hammer hooked through his belt. Sarah's hand went to her own rifle. "You there?" The man didn't answer. He didn't even look up. He set the rail against a post, pulled a nail from a leather pouch, and drove it home with 3 clean strokes of the hammer. Then he reached for another rail. Sarah walked toward him, rifle at her hip, her mouth dry as flour. "I said, you there? This is Whitfield land. Who gave you leave to touch my fence?" He finished driving a nail before he looked up. His eyes were gray as gunmetal, and there was something in them she couldn't read. Not menace, not apology, not anything at all. Just a stillness, the way a deep well is still. He didn't speak. He touched the brim of his hat. Then he bent down, lifted the next rail, and set it in place. "I asked you a question, mister." Another nail. Another rail. He worked as though she wasn't there. Not rudely, not defiantly, just the way a man works when the work is what matters. Sweat had darkened his shirt through the duster. His hands were scarred across the knuckles, one finger crooked from an old break. Sarah stood there with the rifle in her hands and a lecture on her tongue, and slowly, Slowly, she understood that neither would help her. This man was going to fix her fence whether she wanted him to or not. "You deaf?" she asked, quieter now. He shook his head. "Just once." "No." "Mute." He paused. Then, almost imperceptibly, he nodded. Something twisted in her chest. She lowered the rifle. She watched him work another minute, and she noticed the way he favored his left side, the way his breath came a little short. A man who had ridden hard, or been hurt hard, or both. There was a bedroll and a saddlebag lying at the base of the far post. He had not asked for water. He had not asked for anything. She turned toward the house. Halfway there, she looked back. He was still working, 3 rails up now, and the wind pulled his coat around him like a shadow. "Supper's at 6, she called across the pasture. "If you want it." He didn't look up, but she saw his shoulders shift, just slightly, and she thought, though she could not have sworn to it, that the corner of his mouth moved. By sundown, half the fence was mended. By sundown, Sarah Whitfield had begun asking herself a question she had not asked in 11 months. "Who are you, stranger, and why did you come here without being asked?" He came to the porch at 6, exactly, hat in his hand. Sarah had set 2 plates. Beans, cornbread, a slab of salt pork she'd been saving for a bad day. She'd told herself it wasn't a bad day, exactly. Just an unusual one, but she'd cooked the pork anyway. The drifter stood at the bottom step and did not climb until she nodded him up. His boots were caked with red dust. There was blood on his left sleeve, dried brown, and she didn't think it was his. "Sit," she said. "Wash first. Basin's by the door." He washed. He sat. He waited for her to bow her head before he touched the food, and when she said the short grace her mother had taught her, he closed his eyes with her. That surprised her more than anything else that day. They ate without speaking. The only sounds were the fork on tin, the wind against the shutters, and the far-off howl of a coyote calling something up out of the arroyo. Sarah watched him over the rim of her coffee cup. He ate carefully, not fast, not slow, the way a man eats who has been hungry often enough to respect food. When he was done, he stacked his plate on hers and carried both to the wash tub without being asked. "You have a name?" she said. He set the plates down. He drew from his coat pocket a folded scrap of butcher paper and a stub of pencil. He wrote slowly, block letters, and slid it across the table. "Elias." "Elias what?" He hesitated. Then he wrote, "Just Elias." "Just Elias," she repeated. "Where you from, just Elias?" The pencil moved again. "Everywhere. Nowhere. Mostly the road." She almost smiled. She caught it in time. "You know my fence was cut, not broken." He nodded. "You know who did it?" Another nod. But this time he did not reach for the pencil. Sarah leaned back in her chair. The lamp between them threw his face half in gold, half in shadow, and she saw for the first time the old scar that ran from his temple into his beard, a puckered line, the color of raw meat, that only a knife could have made. "You gonna tell me?" He wrote, "Not yet. You won't believe me yet. Try me." He shook his head, slowly, firmly. Then he wrote one more line, folded the paper, and set it in front of her before rising. "I'll sleep in the barn. Fix the rest tomorrow. You don't owe me anything." He touched his hat. He walked out into the dark. Sarah sat with the paper in her hands for a long time. Then she got up, took a blanket from the trunk at the foot of her bed, and carried it to the barn. He was already lying in the straw, boots off, rifle within reach. He sat up when she came in, but she only set the blanket down beside him and turned to go. At the door, she stopped. "Elias," she said, without turning. "My husband died of fever. 14 men have come to this door offering to save me since he was buried. Every one of them wanted the ranch or the land rights, or a warm bed and a woman too tired to argue. Not one of them ever asked what I wanted. Not one of them ever fixed my fence without being asked." She heard him shift in the straw. "I don't know what you're running from," she said. "But this house isn't a hiding place, and I'm not a rescue mission. If you're here to work, you work. If you're here to lie, you leave. Are we clear?" There was a long silence. Then, softly, the first sound she had ever heard from his throat, a low, cracked rasp. "Yes, ma'am." 2 words. Not mute after all. Just choosing. She walked back to the house with her heart beating strangely, and she did not sleep well that night. The next morning, he was in the north pasture at dawn. By noon, the fence was whole. He came to the house for water, and she gave him a jar of it, and he drank it in the yard without sitting down. That afternoon, he mended the roof over the smokehouse. The next day, he cleared the well of the dead possum someone had dropped in it. She hadn't even known it was there, but he did, somehow, and he dragged the thing out with a hooked pole and buried it beyond the arroyo, without a word. On the fourth day, Reverend Coles came calling. He rode up on his gray mare with 2 men behind him, Dale Hoskins from the Mercantile and young Peter Ives, whose father owned the newspaper. They dismounted at the gate. Elias was on the roof of the barn, replacing a section of shingle. He stopped his hammer when he saw them, but he did not come down. "Sarah," the Reverend said, removing his hat. "A word." She came out onto the porch. She did not invite them in. "Word about what, Reverend?" He cleared his throat. He was a good man, in his way, but he was a man who believed the town's peace was his to keep, and today his peace was ruffled. "Word about the man on your roof, Sarah. Folks are talking. A widow, alone, and a stranger sleeping in her barn. It doesn't sit right. It doesn't look right. There's whispers already, and I've come as a friend to tell you that whispers become sermons quick in a town like this." Sarah felt something rise in her throat. Not anger, not exactly. Something older. Something she hadn't let out in 11 months. "He sleeps in the barn," she said evenly, "because he's a hired hand. He works. He eats what I feed him. He hasn't laid a finger on me, hasn't asked a favor, hasn't spoken 10 words. Which is more than I can say for half the men who've come courting since Thomas died." Dale Hoskins shifted his weight. "Sarah, we're just saying. You're saying I ought to send him off. That what you're saying?" "We're saying," said the Reverend gently, "that Marcus Bell has offered you protection and honest work and a name. And you've turned him down. And now this drifter appears the very week Marcus makes his final offer. It looks, Sarah, it looks." She stared at him. "It looks," she said, "like you rode out here on Marcus Bell's errand, Reverend. And I'll thank you to remember whose porch you're standing on." The Reverend's face went white, then red. He put his hat back on. "Sarah, ride on, gentlemen." They rode. Halfway down the trail, Peter Ives turned in his saddle and looked back. A long, measuring look, the kind a man takes when he's memorizing a scene for the telling of it later. Sarah stood on her porch and watched the dust rise. Behind her, on the barn roof, the hammer began again, steady, unhurried, like a heart that had made its choice. They came on the 7th night, and they came with fire. Sarah woke to the smell of smoke and the sound of horses. 6, maybe 7, circling wide around the house the way wolves circle a wounded elk. Her hand was already on the rifle before her feet touched the floor. Through the window, she saw the orange bloom against the black. The smokehouse, burning, a torch thrown clean through the roof Elias had just repaired. "Elias," she shouted, though she didn't know if he could hear her from the barn. A gunshot answered, not from her yard, from the ridge. She dropped below the sill. Another shot punched through the shutter above her head and buried itself in the wall 2 feet from her hip. Splinters rained into her hair. She crawled to the front door, through the bar, and slid the rifle barrel through the gap. The yard was chaos. 2 riders were driving her cattle out through the broken north gate. The gate Elias had just mended, cut again, tonight, deliberately. 2 more circled the barn with torches held high, and a 5th stood in her front yard, calm as Sunday morning, one hand resting on the pommel of his saddle. "Marcus Bell." "Sarah," he called out, pleasant as a picnic. "Come on out, darlin'. Nobody has to get hurt tonight. We just want the drifter. Send him out, and we ride away." She could hear her own breath. She could hear the fire eating the smokehouse. She could hear something else, too, from the barn, a scraping, then a soft, sharp click that she knew was the sound of a Winchester lever being worked by a hand that had worked one 1,000 times. Elias was awake. "Marcus Bell," she called through the door. "You set foot on this porch, and I will bury you next to my husband." He laughed. It was a real laugh, warm and easy. "Sarah, you don't know who he is. That man in your barn, you don't know his name. You don't know his face. You don't know what he did before he rode up here pretending to fix your fence. Send him out, and I'll tell you. Send him out, and you keep your land, keep your cattle, keep your good name in this town. You cut my fence." "I cut nothing," he said, still smiling in the firelight. "I knew it was cut. There's a difference. Send him out, Sarah." For half a heartbeat she wavered. Not toward Marcus, never toward Marcus, but toward the truth of it, the terrible small truth. She didn't know Elias. 7 days. 2 words spoken aloud. Blood on a sleeve she'd never asked about. a scar from a knife, a hidden past he had refused to name. Then the barn door slammed open. Elias walked out into her yard with the Winchester at his shoulder and no hat on his head, and even in the firelight she saw his face for the first time without shadow, gaunt, bearded, but no longer still. His eyes had come alive, and what lived in them was old and clean and terrible. Marcus Bell's smile disappeared. "Elias Rourke," he said softly, almost admiringly. "So it is you." The rifle didn't waver. Elias's voice, when it came, was hoarse from a year of silence, but perfectly clear. "Call them off, Bell. Or what? You'll shoot me in front of a widow? In front of witnesses? The great Elias Rourke, back from the dead, murdering a banker in a lady's front yard? They'll hang you before the sun comes up. They'll try." Sarah's mind was spinning. Elias Rourke. She knew that name. Everyone west of the Pecos knew that name. The gunfighter who had shot 4 Pinkertons in Silver Bow 3 years back and vanished. The man some said had turned outlaw, and others said had turned monk, and no two stories agreed on what he'd done or why he'd done it. The man in her yard. The man who had fixed her fence. "Marcus," she said through the door, and her voice was very steady now. "One question. Just one. Did you kill Thomas?" The banker turned his head. The firelight caught his teeth. "Fever killed Thomas, Sarah. Everyone knows that." "Fever," she said. "Or the well water he drank the week before he took sick. The well you offered to test for me after he died. The well I never let you near again." Silence. The fire crackled. A cow lowed in the distance. "You have no proof of anything, Sarah. I have a dead husband and a dead possum in my well and 6 of your men in my yard tonight. That's proof enough for me." She kicked open the door and stepped out onto the porch with the Winchester at her hip. What happened next happened in the space of 10 seconds. Marcus's hand moved for his pistol. Elias fired from the yard. 1 shot, clean, and the pistol spun away from Marcus's hand along with 2 fingers. Marcus screamed. One of the torch riders wheeled his horse and lit toward the porch. Sarah fired, and the man went out of the saddle backward, arms flung wide, torch cart-wheeling into the dust. The second torch rider dropped his fire and ran his horse for the gate. Elias took him at 40 yards, low in the shoulder, and the man fell but crawled. The 2 riders driving the cattle heard the shots and kept going. They were hired hands, not soldiers, and they had already taken what they'd been paid to take. That left Marcus on the ground, bleeding into her yard from the ruin of his hand. Elias walked to him slowly. He kicked the pistol farther away. He stood over the banker and looked down, and Sarah saw in his face a hunger she had seen once before in a wolf caught in a snare, the hunger to finish at any cost. "Elias," she said. He didn't move. "Elias, look at me." He looked, and she saw the year of silence in his eyes, and the reason for it, and she understood. He had stopped speaking because every time he opened his mouth in the last 3 years, someone had died. "Don't," she said. "Not in my yard. Not for me." His jaw worked. His finger stayed on the trigger. "He killed Thomas," Elias rasped. "I know. He came here to take you. I know. If I don't finish him, he comes back." "Then he comes back," she said, "and we'll be ready. But if you shoot him now, you'll never stop being what he made you tonight. And I didn't feed you at my table for that." The Winchester lowered. Slowly, slowly. It touched the dirt. Marcus Bell wept in the dust of Sarah Whitfield's yard, and up on the ridge, the last of his men rode away into the dark. They tied Marcus Bell to the porch rail with his own belt. By the time the marshal rode out the next morning, summoned by Sarah's handwritten note carried by a boy from the nearest homestead, the banker had confessed twice. Once to Sarah at gunpoint, and once, freely and weeping, to the sky, as men sometimes do when they finally understand what they've done. He had poisoned the Whitfield well the week before Thomas took sick. He had spread the rumors about Sarah's mind unraveling. He had paid 3 men to cut her fences and kill her cattle, and he had planned to burn her out that night and buy the land for a song from a broken widow the following week. The marshal, whose name was Cobb and who had known Thomas Whitfield since boyhood, listened without expression, then spat once into the dust and hauled Marcus up over his saddle like a sack of grain. "He'll hang," Cobb said to Sarah. "I'll see to it myself." He looked past her at Elias, who stood on the porch with his rifle across his arm and his hat pulled low again. "That your hired hand?" "Yes." "Got a name?" She met the marshal's eyes. She did not blink. "Elias. He doesn't say much." Cobb studied the drifter a long moment. She watched him weigh what he thought he was seeing against what he could prove and what he cared to prove. Then he touched his hat. "Ma'am, if your hired hand happens to move on before the circuit judge comes through, I don't reckon anybody in this county will be much troubled. You understand me?" "I understand you, Marshal." He nodded once and rode away with Marcus Bell tied over his saddle. The last of Sarah's cattle wandered back through the broken gate on their own in the afternoon, thirsty and confused. She counted them twice. She lost only 2. That night, she cleaned the burn on Elias's forearm, a small wound, from a spark that had caught him during the fire, and he sat at her kitchen table with his sleeve rolled up and let her tend it. The lamp threw them both in gold. Outside, the wind had died. The world felt strange in its stillness, the way the world feels after a storm has finally passed. "You're going," she said. "Not a question." "Have to." "Because of the Marshal?" "Because of me." He watched her hands work. 3 years ago, I killed 4 men in Silver Bow. Pinkertons. They were guarding a paymaster who'd been stealing from the miners. Men with families. Men who were starving. I told the paymaster to give it back. He drew. His men drew. I was faster. Then it was self-defense. "It was," he said. "But it didn't matter. The Pinkertons don't forgive. There's a bounty on me in 6 territories. The only reason I've lived this long is I stopped talking. A silent man isn't Elias Rourke. A silent man is just another drifter. And you spoke last night." "I spoke last night." She wrapped the bandage. She tied it off. "Why?" she asked. "Why me? Why this ranch? Of all the fences in the West, why did you stop at mine?" He was quiet a long time. Then he reached into his coat and drew something out and laid it on the table between them. It was a small tintype photograph, badly worn at the corners. A woman in a plain dress, standing in front of a farmhouse. A young girl beside her, maybe 7 years old, both smiling at the camera. "My wife," he said, "and my daughter. Cholera took them the winter before Silver Bow. That's the farmhouse where we lived. That's the fence I never finished mending before they got sick." Sarah could not speak. "When I came over the ridge and saw yours," he said, "broken exactly the way mine was broken. 3 rails down, 2 posts pulled. I got off my horse before I knew I was doing it. I started fixing it before I remembered I don't fix things anymore. I don't do anything anymore." He looked up at her. His gray eyes were wet, and he made no move to hide it. "You gave me supper. You gave me a blanket. You asked me questions like I was still a man. Sarah, I hadn't been a man in 3 years." She reached across the table. She took his scarred hand in both of hers, and she held it, and she did not let go for a long time. "Elias Rourke," she said, "you fixed my fence. You saved my ranch. You held your fire when I asked you to, and that took more courage than pulling the trigger. Whatever you were, whatever you've done, you're a man tonight. Do you hear me? I hear you. Then hear this too." She pressed his hand to her cheek, and she felt the roughness of his knuckles against her skin, and she did not care that her tears wet his fingers. "Scars mean it lived. Thomas used to say that when I asked about the mark on his shoulder from the war. Scars mean it lived, Sarah. Don't be ashamed of what survived." He closed his eyes. They sat like that a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was almost gone. "I have to leave in the morning. I know. The Pinkertons will find out. Bo will talk in his cell. My name will move faster than I can. If I stay here, they come here. I know. But—" He turned his hand over and closed his fingers around hers. "I could come back. When it's done. When it's safe. If there's still a place for me at your table when it is." Sarah looked at him, at this hollow-eyed man who had walked into her life with a hammer instead of a hat in his hand, at this killer with tender hands, at this widower who had recognized her ruined fence because it looked like his own, and she felt something in her chest that she had thought was buried with Thomas. "There will be a place," she said. "As long as I have a table. As long as I have a fence. As long as I have breath." He drew her carefully across the table and pressed his forehead to hers. Not a kiss. Something older than a kiss. A promise, dust-stained and rifle-scented and true. Outside, an owl called once from the arroyo, and the night held its breath around them. He left before dawn. She heard him saddle his horse in the dark. She heard him lead it out through the gate he had mended. She did not go to the window, because she had promised herself she would not, and because she knew if she saw him right away she would call him back, and she loved him too much to do that. On the kitchen table, when she came down, he had left 3 things: the tintype of his wife and daughter, a folded scrap of butcher paper, and the small stub of pencil. The note said, I left the photograph because it is safer with you than with me. I will come back for it." She kept it on the mantel, next to Thomas's watch. The circuit judge came through in October. Marcus Bell was hanged in the square of Redemption Flats for the murder of Thomas Whitfield and the attempted murder of Sarah, and half the town came out to watch, and the other half stayed home from shame. Reverend Coles preached that Sunday on the sin of listening to whispers, and he did not name Sarah, but she was in the front pew, and everyone knew whose forgiveness he was asking for. The Hoskins boy from the Mercantile came out the next week and rebuilt her smokehouse for free, and would not take her money. Peter Ives wrote a piece for the newspaper about the quiet drifter who saved the Whitfield spread, and though he never printed a name, folks read between the lines and knew. The Pinkertons came in November, 2 of them, in long coats, asking after a man called Rourke. Sarah met them at the gate with the Winchester across her arm and Marshall Cobb, by coincidence, having coffee on her porch. She told them she had hired a mute drifter for a week in the summer, and he had ridden on, and she did not know his name and did not care to. Marshall Cobb backed her up. The Pinkertons rode away and did not come back. Winter came. She ran the ranch alone, but not lonely. The Hoskins boy came Sundays, and the widow Ames from 3 miles over began visiting Wednesdays with her sewing. And Sarah discovered that the town she had held at arm's length for 11 months had, without her noticing, decided to hold her back. Spring came. She replaced the last of Marcus Bell's cut rails with fresh cedar. She dug a new well 30 yards from the poison one and capped the old one with stone. She rode her cattle to market in June and got a fair price, and she put half the money aside in a tin box beneath the floorboards of her bedroom, and she told no one what she was saving for. 2 years passed. She did not marry any of the men who came asking, and by the end of the 2nd year, they had stopped asking. The town said Sarah Whitfield was a woman who preferred her own company, and the town was not entirely wrong and not entirely right. On a warm evening in the 3rd September, she was mending a bridle on her porch when she heard a horse coming up the trail from the south. She did not look up right away. Horses came and went, the postman, the Hoskins boy, riders passing through. But this horse stopped at her gate, and it did not move on, and after a long while she raised her eyes. He sat the saddle the way he always had, quiet, patient, hat pulled low. His beard was shorter. There was gray in it now that had not been there before. His duster was newer. His hands, when he took off his hat, were the same scarred hands she had held across her kitchen table 2 years and 1 month before. She stood up. The bridle fell to the porch boards. He dismounted. He walked to the bottom of the steps. He did not climb until she nodded him up. "Elias," she said. "Ma'am, you came back. I said I would." The Pinkertons? A federal marshal in Denver took my statement about Silver Bow. There was a miner still alive who remembered what really happened. The bounty was lifted a year ago. I would have come sooner, but I wanted to come free. I wanted to come as a man with a name. He drew a folded paper from his coat pocket and held it out to her. "Elias Rourke," he said. "Pardoned. It's the only name I've got, but it's mine now." She took the paper. She did not read it. She set it on the porch rail and put her arms around him instead, and he held her like a man holds something he thought he'd lost forever, and neither of them spoke for a very long time. Then she stepped back and touched the scar at his temple. "You hungry, Elias Rourke?" "Yes, ma'am. Supper's at 6. "I remember." She smiled, the first full smile that had crossed her face since the night he'd walked out of her barn with a rifle in his hand, and she led him inside. That night, she took the tintype off the mantel and placed it in his palm. He looked at it a long time. Then he set it back on the mantel, gently, in the same place she had kept it. "They'd want me to stay," he said. "I know. They'd want me to be happy. I know. Sarah." He took her hands. "I'm not asking to replace him, Thomas. I'm asking to build something new. On the same land. Beside the same fence. I know, Elias. Is there room?" She looked at him. The drifter who had fixed her fence without asking. The killer who had lowered his rifle when she'd asked him to. The widower who had recognized her broken world because he had lived in one. And she understood that some questions answer themselves. "There's room," she said. They were married that October by the same Reverend Coles who had once ridden out to warn her about the whispers. He wept during the vows, and no one was quite sure why. Elias built a new porch on the south side of the house, and Sarah planted lilacs beside it. And every spring for the rest of their long lives the lilacs bloomed purple against the cedar rails of the fence he had mended without being asked. Years later, when she was old and he was older, she would tell the young preacher who came asking about the story that 14 suitors had ridden up her trail after Thomas died, and she had turned them all away. The 15th, she would say, never came up the trail asking. He came across the ridge with a hammer, and he saw what was broken, and he began to fix it. And when the young preacher rode away in the dusk, he would look back and see them on the porch, two figures side by side, framed by lilacs and cedar, silent as they had been silent that first summer, and closer than most words could ever say.